I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Last week, Professor Robert George of Princeton wrote an impassioned letter to U.S. Attorney General William Barr, urging him and the Justice Department to take action on the pornography epidemic ravaging lives across the country. Professor George joins John Stonestreet today on the BreakPoint Podcast to talk about the letter and the devastating effects of pornography, sex trafficking, broken marriages, abused children, addiction, broken families, and on and on. What role should government play in combating the porn industry? And what can ordinary people do in the face of such a widespread epidemic? Here are John Stonestreet and Professor Robert George.
Welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. I want to start a discussion here that's been happening on Twitter. In fact, just about a week ago, a letter was sent to the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, essentially requesting clarification around existing obscenity laws and whether they could be applied to the online pornography scourge that we have in America today. Now, typically a letter like that wouldn't draw a whole lot of headlines, but the author of the letter is one of the reasons that this has drawn so much attention. He's been called America's most influential conservative Christian thinker. I don't think that's hyperbole. None other than Professor Robert P. George, who is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals at Princeton University, also frequently a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, 2015 winner of the Wilberforce Award from the Colson Center, longtime friend of Chuck Colson, co-author of the Manhattan Declaration with Chuck and Timothy George, and he joins us here on the BreakPoint Podcast. Professor George, always an honor to have you on.
Oh, it's my honor, John. It's a pleasure to be back on the show. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, listen, absolutely. And so this was I think, a very bold move. And one could say that, 5, 6, 7 years ago, a statement to the Attorney General of the United States asking to do something about online pornography would have gone on deaf ears. You clearly think that there's something happening either culturally or legally, politically, that led you to write this letter. So describe a little bit here kind of where you think the cultural needle is and, why you did this.
Well, thank you, John, and I'll be happy to do it. I'm glad to have the opportunity to explain some of these issues and my own motivation to the very important BreakPoint audience. A couple of things. First, back in the previous administration, the Obama administration, there was no interest in the enforcement of obscenity laws. They were put on the back burner to the extent that they were enforced at all, which was not very much, except in some limited ways in the child pornography area. But we have a new administration. We have a new attorney general. We have an attorney general who speaks quite openly about the need for moral reform in our country. Someone who recognizes and talks about the way the moral ecology of the country has been degraded and the practical real-life impact on people, on children, on families. He's concerned about those things. He gave a very highly covered, criticized a great deal by the liberal media, of course, but nevertheless highly covered speech at Notre Dame, where he talked about the ways in which secular ideology now presents itself as a religion, a kind of neo-pagan religion that pushes ideas, especially when it comes to the sanctity of human life and marriage and sexuality, that are antithetical to Christian beliefs and the beliefs of a great many other traditions of faith. So we have a new sheriff in town. We have a new attorney general with a new attitude, new sets of concerns. So I wanted to reach out to him. The other thing is that the situation has simply gotten much worse when it comes to pornography, when it comes to obscenity. It was bad enough 10 years ago. It was bad enough 50 years ago. It's much worse now. Online pornography changes everything. And mainly the reason for that is that it creates a bigger market, which means more women exploited. And it becomes accessible in ways never before to children, especially very young children who on their smartphones can easily access the most grotesque, most horrifying, most corrupting and depraving forms of pornography. So, John, something has to be done. Something simply has to be done. The situation is out of control. Pornography now is not only a public morality crisis, which it has been for many years since the rise of the sexual revolution and the porn culture. It's not just a public morality crisis, which would be bad enough. It's a public health crisis because of sex addiction, because of what happens to young kids, mostly boys, but even some girls, when it comes to the consequences, the health consequences for them of pornography. And it's a public safety issue because more and more women are being exploited. Women are being trafficked into the pornography trade. Some of the worst forms of sexual slavery that we have around the world now and in the United States are connected to the sex industry, including the porn industry. So these were my motivations. This is why I decided now is the time to be in touch with Attorney General Barr, whom I know a bit, to ask him for a clarification of our existing obscenity laws, and to plead with him to more systematically and vigorously enforce those laws to protect potential victims and victims of sex trafficking, to protect our young boys and girls, to protect families, to protect people who suffer the consequences of porn addiction and sex addiction, which are devastating for marriages, devastating for families, devastating for communities.
So one of the things that many of our listeners may or may not know is that, this is coming kind of in the context of a pretty robust debate on Twitter back in December. And I think that it's part of a larger, how do I want to say it? One of the things that Bill Barr said in his speech, which I think was so important and powerful, is that the unbridled pursuit of personal appetites at the expense of the common good are things to be condemned. And yet one of the people on the other side of this issue are people who are on the same side of so many other political issues of us. And then when talking about here, the conservative libertarians, and there was a huge debate on Twitter between people calling for the regulation of pornography. I think it was Catholic writer Matt Walsh at the Daily Wire who kind of sparked this debate and just really got a flurry of condemnation from libertarians saying, listen, having the government involved in this is the wrong thing. And I know, Professor George, you're a proponent of limited government. None of us want government out of control. Why is the government the right entity to act when it comes to online pornography right now?
Well, the government has to be involved because we've got a very serious social problem. We have harm to the common good. That was Bill Barr's point. It's the common good that is being damaged here. But more fundamentally, it's the law that needs to be involved. We're not talking about building a big new government bureaucracy. Concerns for limited government are not only the dangers that big and unbridled government presents to individual rights. Perhaps even more fundamentally, it's a concern about government usurping the authority of families, churches, voluntary associations, the institutions of civil society, what the great 18th century British thinker, Irish actually thinker called Edmund Burke talked about when he talked about the little platoons of society that do the lion's share of work when it comes to providing health, education, and welfare and transmitting to each new generation the values and virtues that are necessary for people to lead successful lives and be good citizens. That's why we're concerned about limited government. We know government usurps the role of institutions of civil society, beginning with the family. And we're not asking for any usurpation. We're not asking for some big new bureaucracy or another alphabet soup of letters standing for a big federal agency. We're just talking about enforcing laws of the sort that in previous generations were regularly enforced without big governmental bureaucracies, just with the ordinary mechanisms and institutions of the law. And we're asking for it to protect people from real life consequences of addiction, of exploitation, often of violence, corruption, depravity. It used to be believed by many people, it was never plausible. Nevertheless, a lot of people came to believe, were sold on the idea that pornography is merely naughtiness, harmless naughtiness. Hugh Hefner sold this idea when he launched his very financially successful Playboy magazine in the early 1950s. Sophisticated people, Hefner taught, were people who understood and appreciated the kind of naughtiness, the transgressiveness of pornography. Well, pornography was bad then. What Hefner was selling was bad then. It's gotten very much worse now. And no longer can anybody who knows anything plausibly entertain the idea that pornography is harmless or that it's mere naughtiness. It is not harmless. It's devastating for children. It's devastating for women who are exploited in the production of pornography. It's devastating for families when fathers and husbands become addicted to pornography, and increasingly women too as well. So women are still the minority. It's overwhelmingly men and boys who are the victims of pornography addiction, but it can happen to women, and increasingly it is happening to women and to girls. So we've got a big public crisis on our hands. As I said before, it's a public health and public safety as well as public morality crisis. The libertarian thinking is outmoded, to say the least, and to say the best. It is outmoded. It's premised on the idea that pornography is harmless naughtiness. It's not harmless at all. It's extremely harmful, and it's harmful to a vast swath of people in our society.
You know, one of the things that I've found so interesting over the last 5 years is how many secular European governments have come to that same conclusion, Professor George. I mean, I'm thinking of, I think it was a British Prime Minister, I don't think it was Tony Blair, I think it was David Cameron after him, who proposed that internet providers should have a default position on pornography to off unless someone actually requested it. In other words, don't have it as a default on where it can target children, but let's have it off. And I think there was even a story out of Iceland where parliamentarians there were proposing an all-out ban on pornography as a public health crisis. And you're starting to hear this more and more and more. And yet when you propose that, the backlash, particularly from the left, but not just the left, is pretty overwhelming. I mean, so one of the things we have that we're dealing with is obviously the sexual revolution has sold America and the West on this sexual autonomy being the highest good, being the definition of human dignity, and so on. And as Bill Barr's comments say, is what we're really arguing is that self-fulfillment in the same sense isn't the highest good. It's actually damaging to others. It seems like a really heavy lift to argue this, culturally speaking, when we're so committed to adult happiness being the definition of marriage, to self-determination being the definition of human dignity. Give us some ways that we can argue this to our friends and our neighbors.
Well, let's begin by just asking an ordinary wife whose husband has become addicted to pornography how her adult happiness is going. Let's ask the mother or father of a child, a boy or a girl, who has become addicted to pornography, whose mental and moral development is now threatened by an obsession, a compulsion to access pornography. Let's ask them about how their adult happiness is going. Oh, and by the way, while we're at it, those girls and women who are trafficked into sexual slavery in the production of pornography, wonder how their adult happiness is going. These claims are being made on behalf of allowing pornography to be unregulated, unprohibited, are at this point just laughable. They're just ridiculous. There are real victims, John, real victims, flesh and blood, men and women, who are victims of an industry that is raking in literally tens of billions of dollars a year. I've seen different estimates. All of them are 80 billion and up a year. Wow. Enormous amounts of money are being made in the pornography trade. And by the way, a good deal of that money is being made by so-called respectable people in suits, in office suites, who don't seem to have any particular close connection with pornography, but where that is ultimately where the money's coming from. It's their adult happiness, I guess, that's flourishing just at the moment as they rake in the dough. Right. Enough of this. Enough of this. Those European jurisdictions, who the progressives very often point to as people that we should look up to, or as countries that we should look up to and that we should mimic and that we should model, they're actually way ahead of us on this in some cases. For once, they actually are providing a model that we can look to, because they have at least begun to recognize the serious public health, public safety, and public morality crisis that is contemporary pornography and is occasioned by the pornography industry. A few years ago, John, the great Muslim American public intellectual Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and I wrote together to the 5 leading American hotel chain CEOs, asking them, pleading with them in the name of decency, to remove the offerings of pornography in their hotel rooms. before any of them did that, now a couple of them actually have, Marriott and, if I'm recalling correctly off the top of my head, Hilton. I hope I'm not confusing it with Hyatt, but in any event, a couple of them have done it. But before they finally relented and removed the porn offerings from their hotel rooms, the others, by the way, as far as I know, continue to offer it. But before any of the American chains did the right thing, there was a Danish hotel chain that did the right thing with no prompting, certainly from me. We didn't reach out to them. We only reached out to the American ones. It was a Danish hotel chain that removed the porn, and they removed the porn because they recognized, and in the CEO's statement he made this clear, they recognized that porn production was a great motivator for the sexual exploitation and trafficking of women, especially women from poor countries, from third world countries, who were lured into the trade, who are sometimes kidnapped, who were literally enslaved. So there, they did the right thing for at least one of the right reasons.
Hi, Shane Morris here again. We'll get right back to John Stonestreet and Robert George in just a moment. January is almost over, so you only have a few more days to get a 1-year subscription to World Magazine in exchange for your donation to the Colson Center. This offer includes 24 print issues, as well as full access to digital content from a trusted news source that's grounded in hope and biblical truth. You can give today and receive your subscription at breakpoint.org/January. That's breakpoint.org/January. Now back to John Stonestreet and Robert George.
In your letter, Professor George, you requested clarification from the Department of Justice on current statutes that are already in U.S. law. Do you think that where the law stands now, that there's actually enough leverage, enough clarity and definition to shut down or at least dramatically regulate the porn industry?
Really good question, John. I think the existing obscenity laws will be sufficient to give us a good start toward protecting young people in particular and beginning to protect women. Now, due to Supreme Court rulings, mainly in the 1960s and 70s, unjustified, really bad Supreme Court rulings, we're limited right now in how we can strengthen those laws. But with the newly constituted Supreme Court, I'd like to come back and revisit those issues and look for some ways in which we can actually strengthen obscenity laws, especially in ways that will impede the industry and its trafficking of women. So yes, I mean, I think we've got laws on the books now that have passed constitutional tests, even under the old courts, that will help a good deal, and then we can do more. But let's start, as I suggested to Attorney General Barr, by enforcing the laws that we have. The Obama administration didn't do it. It's really time for this administration to do it in a systematic and vigorous way.
So do you have any, I mean, this may be too much of inside baseball that you're willing to share, Professor George, but do you have any response so far from the Attorney General? Any indication that something here might be done?
No, I have not had a response so far. Of course, it's only about a week, and these things do take time. A response will have to be formulated. I asked for a good deal of detail, especially when it came to the current attitudes and policies of the Justice Department with respect to obscenity. There are some clarifications that are needed because when these laws were written, we were not talking about online pornography, electronically transmitted pornography or presented pornography. We were rather talking about the hard copy stuff, the magazines and so forth, and the videos. So there are some questions there that the Justice Department's got to think through, but part of the reason that I wrote the letter was to get them thinking about it, to stimulate them, to motivate them to think about those things so that they could get a position in place, see what they thought they could do, and begin doing it to push back against the porn industry and the porn plague. Bill Barr is a good man. He's concerned about the well-being of families and children and women who are trafficked into pornography and men who are addicted. I believe he'll do the right thing. I'm expecting a reply, but much more important than whether I get a reply is that the Justice Department do what I'm pleading with them to do. They clarified their position, they look hard at what they can do under existing laws, and they begin again vigorously and systematically to enforce these laws. And the reason, again, is to protect people. This is not to prevent people from having fun. It's to protect actual victims, flesh and blood human beings, women, children, wives, husbands, families, communities.
Yeah, that's exactly. I guess it's hard for me to imagine that people don't grasp the predatory nature of pornography today. I mean, I have children. I was once on a panel. I won't name who the other panelist was. It was another conservative commentator who's much more of a kind of a libertarian in his views, and he basically said, kind of took that laissez-faire view of pornography. He was an older gentleman, referred to his dad's Playboy, collection back in the 50s or 60s, and I was like, look, I just don't think you understand the grossness that's online. And not only that, but if I were walking down the street with my daughters and a man even flashed himself at her, I could put him in jail, right, for sexual assault, essentially.
That's
why
right.
is it any
and by
different?
the way, John, I'll interrupt you just to say, prostitution remains illegal. The Supreme Court has never said that we cannot have laws against prostitution. And almost all jurisdictions, except a few in Nevada, and not all of Nevada, have laws against prostitution. That's paying people to have sex or people accepting money to have sex. But that happens in the porn industry every day.
Hell, every day.
And yet the porn
right.
industry is not prosecuted, and it needs to be. I want Bill Barr to look at that possibility as well.
It
John,
is. It's assaulting.
While I'm on the line, if I cross the line here, just stop me. I'm not going to use any bad words. But the pornography industry has benefited from honorable people not knowing what they are putting out there and making available to our children. And so I've had enough of that. We need to tell our people, inform our people. I'm not going to make anybody look at anything. I don't look at this stuff myself. But you can be assured that the stuff being put out there today and made available to children is not your grandfather's Playboy magazine with the peekaboo pictures of naked nipples. That's nothing compared to what you have today. Again, I have not myself seen it. But the internet conversation included the report, which seemed to be verified by the media, that last week the fourth most watched video on Pornhub, the big porn site, was of a young woman, a girl really, a teenage girl, looked like she was teenage, strapped down not only by her wrists and ankles, but also by her mouth to the floor or to some sort of a platform or something like that, being penetrated by a machine while she was burnt with hot wax. No, this is not your grandfather's Playboy. And no, this is not acceptable. Making this sort of thing available to people, especially to children, especially to young boys who are forming their attitudes toward women, their understanding toward girls, understanding toward the opposite sex, having their conception of the dignity of women corrupted in this way. No, this is not acceptable. And we're not going to fall for any libertarian nonsense that protects the porn industry from being held accountable for what they are doing to people, what they are doing to women, what they are doing to children.
And the detail that I think many also miss is not only just how much worse it's gotten, but it comes after kids. I tell this to parents all the time. Your kid may not be looking for pornography now. Pornography is looking for your kid. I've talked to so many parents who've, through pop-ups, through enticing, links here or there, through, clickbait sorts of things that just kind of devolve lower and lower and lower until you get into the worst. I mean, I can't tell you, Professor George, the number of, just last year, a crying father, literally after an event, crying father talking about a 9-year-old daughter found herself in this kind of, very popular app. It's even on, it's smartphones too. That's the other thing. It's coming in our hands where there's no accountability whatsoever. In any other context, this would be assault, and there's really no reason whatsoever that it's not considered assault when it comes to this as well. Professor, I've got one more just really important question. You have a platform that God has given to you as you've stewarded your intellectual and scholarly gifts. Again, having been called America's foremost conservative intellectual, I don't think that's hyperbole at all. I know Chuck Colson so loved and valued the career that God had given you. And so you have this access to someone like Bill Barr that the rest of us just don't have. And yet, surely there's stuff that the rest of us can do. What would you say as you're trying to lead this charge on this kind of political, governmental level at the top of culture? What can the rest of us do?
Well, thank you for asking me that question and reminding me of my wonderful friendship with Chuck Colson. He was just such a great man and such a hero, and he did so much for me. He was just such a source of support for me, and of course it was such an honor and privilege to work together with Chuck on so many projects, including the Manhattan Declaration and the Doing the Right Thing series. Look, whatever opportunities and gifts I've been given, they're given to me for a reason: to serve, to help, to undo wrongs that are being done, at least to do my bit, at least to try. And that's what I'm going to do. And I want as many people with me, working alongside me, hand in hand, as possible. People may think, well, you know, who am I? I don't have much influence. I'm just an ordinary working person. I'm just an ordinary mom at home. You are somebody. This is democracy. Your voice counts. Think about how you vote. Write letters to your local newspaper. Use your Facebook or Twitter accounts to get the message out, to stimulate the conversation, to promote decency and honor, to call attention to the horrible things that are going on, for example, in the pornography business, and with abortion and other great human rights violations that we have in our own time. Get together with other people, talk to your children, talk to other family members, talk to your friends. Don't be afraid to raise the issue. Help to cause a buzz, help to cause a conversation in the country. Get people thinking about the issue who otherwise might just avert their gaze and never think about the issue. Nobody wants to be looked at as a scold or somebody who's constantly forcing people to talk about moral issues. But you don't have to talk about it 24 hours a day. It doesn't have to be your only conversation. But there are moments when it is appropriate to raise serious issues with your friends, workmates, neighbors, family members. And certainly, if you're doing social media, if you've got a Facebook account, if you've got a Twitter account, you can certainly get involved politically, get involved with the local people in your community who want to do something about porn. Demand to know where your politicians stand. I wrote to the Attorney General. Each of you, each listener to BreakPoint has a congressman. Each listener has state representatives and state senators. Get in touch with them. Make sure they know what you think needs to be done. First of all, let them know you know this is a huge problem. And let them know that you expect them to be doing something about it. It's possible here to work at every level. Nobody's voice is not needed. Nobody's voice is unnecessary. Everybody's got a role to play, and you got to play it. I mean, those of us who are operating where I'm operating, you know, we don't have any. I don't have an army. I'm not General Eisenhower with an army, but I can't command forces. I need people standing alongside me, working with me. And I'm sure everybody else who's in the forefront of the anti-porn and pro-life movements and other important movements feels the same way that I do. You know, don't imagine that it's people like me who can take care of this. We can't. I'm just one person. I happen to have a good platform, but I'm just one person. I need hundreds and thousands and millions of people standing alongside of me. I'm just really one of you. I'm just one of you, and you need to be with me. We need to work together. I'm not better. You know, we're all in this together. We're all equals struggling to do the right thing.
Amen. And if you come to breakpoint.org, we will link you to where you can read the text of this important article. One easy thing to do is just take this podcast and share it, and take the text of this letter and share it, and encourage your politician and your friends and neighbors to also share it widely. My guest today on the BreakPoint Podcast has been Professor Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence, Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, who has just, I think, kicked off, or at least amplified, hopefully, what's going to be a very, very important conversation going into 2020. Professor George, I appreciate what you're doing here and your leadership in this area, and certainly am grateful for you taking the time to share it with our BreakPoint audience today.
It's my very great pleasure. Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. And remember, get your 1-year subscription to World Magazine with your January gift to BreakPoint and the Colson Center. Just come to breakpoint.org/January for more details. That's breakpoint.org/January. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.